All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Jackie and I'm coming from the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, California. I'm really excited to be joining you today because we get to have a scientist scoop where we get to talk to one of our scientists here at the Academy about some colorful creatures of the sea. In fact, let's go ahead and introduce her right now. Let's go ahead and say a big hello to Allison.
Hi.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Allison, today. Now, before we get started, there's a couple of things that we're going to be asking you to do. Today, we're going to be asking you to turn and talk to one another about some of the things you already know, or we'll also be asking you to use that chat box to let us know what are some of the things you observe, what are some of the questions you have, as well as if there's anything else that you would like to know today. So go ahead and use that chat box throughout our time. Well, let's go ahead and kind of dive right in. So Allison, how did you get into learning and becoming a scientist yourself?
Well, I grew up in a small town in New York State, so upstate, pretty far from the ocean, but it was a rural area, and I loved to play outside, so I think I really liked nature from a young age, and that slowly grew into wanting to learn more about it and also protect it, because as we, as human populations grow and we do more and more things, we're putting other species in danger, and so I wanted to do something to learn about other species and protect them. So I lived pretty far from the ocean, so it took a while to get into marine biology, but I had a job in California at one point, and so I came out to California and I was actually working with birds. But on all of my days off, this is where I would go. I would be out on the ocean at the tide pools, looking to see whatever kind of crazy things I could find. And so I decided, all right, I want to become a marine biologist. And so I ended up going to graduate school then at UCLA. So I moved out to California. And in graduate school, I was part of a pretty big lab. And we all went to Indonesia together, which is a country in Southeast Asia. And we worked with Indonesian students, and we learned about all of the different animals that live out there. And I learned to scuba dive and snorkel at that point. And so I stayed in California and came up here after that.
Great. So what kind of drew you into studying marine life in general?
Yeah, so I was always amazed with how much biodiversity there was in the ocean. So who knows what biodiversity is? If you want, you can turn to your neighbor, talk about it. Let's come up with a definition for biodiversity.
All right, so go ahead, everybody. Turn and talk to a neighbor sitting next to you. What do you think biodiversity means? All right, so teachers, if you want to go ahead and use that chat box to let us know maybe one or two definitions or ideas of what is biodiversity.
Yeah, seeing some good answers coming in. So one example, lots of different species. That's a good way to describe biodiversity. So bio refers to biology, studying life, and diversity is, diversity, lots of different types. So there's so many different animals and plants in the world, and when we are interested in studying that biodiversity, usually we're trying to figure out like how it all exists, like what are all these species doing, where are they, and maybe even how they evolved.
Yeah, so that seems like a really big kind of topic, biodiversity. How do you study that?
Yeah, so it helps to hone in on one type of animal to try to, narrow the question, figure out, okay, well, if we just look at one type of animal, let's figure out why there's so many species. And I notice a lot of people are suggesting that one part of biodiversity is discovering new species, and that's true as well. So we have to be able to count how many species there are, which means we have to know what the species are in the first place. So I've focused on this group of animals called nudibranchs. And so now we're going to really focus in and figure out what is a nudibranch. So they are part of a bigger group of animals called mollusks. And so let's talk about mollusks.
Mm-hmm.
So can anyone think of an example of maybe a bivalve or a cephalopod or a gastropod? So these are the three major groups within mollusks.
All right, so let's go ahead and take a moment. Turn and talk to a neighbor sitting next to you. Can you find an example of a bivalve, cephalopods, or gastropods? All right, everybody, let's go ahead and come back together as a group. We've gotten a lot of different types of examples of these. Well, let's go ahead and dive a little bit deeper. So the bivalves.
Yeah, so bivalves include clams, which a lot of people came up with, and oysters, and other things that have two shells, like this.
Mm-hmm.
And then cephalopods, we didn't get many guesses for cephalopods, but those include octopuses and cuttlefish and squid. And then lastly, we have gastropods, which include snails and also slugs. So nudibranchs fall into this last group. They are slugs. And the funny thing about slugs is, well, you've probably seen them here on land. And just because you see a slug doesn't mean it's a nudibranch. So while all nudibranchs are slugs, not all slugs are nudibranchs. So on your screen here, we've got two different slugs, and only one of them is actually a nudibranch. So we're going to do a poll to figure out which one you think is the nudibranch.
All right, so as a class, go ahead and vote. Which do you think is a nudibranch? Slug A or slug B?
Mm-hmm.
All right, about 10 more seconds. And 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, so hopefully you voted. Let's go ahead and see how those votes came out.
All right, so we've got some split answers, but the majority of you voted for slug B, and it turns out that is the nudibranch. But in order to know that, you'd really have to know what defines a nudibranch, which I haven't even told you yet. So good job for getting it right. But for those of you who didn't, that's okay, because why would you know? After this, you will know.
Yeah.
So it's all in the name. A nudibranch, actually, if you split the word up, it refers to a Latin word, nudus, which means naked, and a Greek word, branchia, which means gills. So nudibranchs have naked gills. Now, I mean, really, their whole body is naked, right? They're not wearing clothes. But in this case, the naked part really refers to exposed, outside the body, instead of, with fish, gills are usually they're hidden in like crevices, slits in their neck. So nudibranchs have these gills sticking out. And in this photo, it's this frilly thing on their butt. And so those gills is how they breathe. They're actually getting oxygen out of the water using them.
Interesting. All right.
Yeah. And so this type of gill is called a branchial plume, and it's on a lot of different nudibranchs. This is another species that has a branchial plume. And the word branchial, it doesn't just refer to gills. It really refers to anything that you breathe with. So humans also we've got lungs, but leading down to those lungs is actually the branchial tubes. And so we also have kind of branchial thing in our own body. So, animals, all kind of similar in some ways. Nudibranchs, they don't all have a branchial plume. Some of them have different ways of having exposed gills. So this next type of nudibranch, they have this little things all over their body called serrata, and they actually breathe through those. And it's not just for breathing. There's actually extension, like parts of their guts are up in those serrata as well. So we'll talk a little more about that later, but they're digesting food in there and they're also breathing through them. So
that's
multi-purpose.
Interesting. So they're using those kind of serrata as their digestion and as their breathing.
Yeah, it's crazy.
All right. Well, that's something new.
And then another type of these gills that nudibranchs have are actually a little more hidden. Instead of having stuff on their back, they have under their sides. There's some gills there as well. So this group of nudibranchs, it's a little less obvious. They don't have any frilly parts on their back, but they still have those exposed gills.
All right. So there's a lot of different types of nudibranchs, it sounds like. How do we categorize them? Because I've seen so many different colors here.
Yeah. So it's important for us to be able to group different species, figure out which ones are related to each other. And if you look at, all of these different species, you might think, oh, wow, they're all different colors. Maybe we should group them by color. But it turns out that wouldn't be very accurate. You actually see a lot of colors in all of these groups, and it doesn't really mean anything about how they're related. Instead, we look at things like their shape. And so all of these on your screen right now, they have a very similar body shape. They all have that branchial plume, and they all have pretty large little, see those little, what look like tentacles at the front of their body? Those are actually called rhinophores, and they use it to kind of sense and smell with. So we look at those shapes. We also look at the shapes of their parts that are inside their body, and that's how we group them together and figure out how they're related.
All right, so we're going to pause here for just a little bit. Some questions have kind of popped through our chat box. And so we had a question about, so the animals that we've been looking at, are these the animals that are always going to be found at the bottom of the ocean?
Well, they do need, so as slugs, they need to be able to crawl along, right? They're not going to be swimming like fish, although there are a few examples of sea slugs that can swim. You should look. We'll send you a link to a cool video of that later. Yeah, we can do that, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, but for the most part, they are on the sea floor, and so that doesn't mean that they're very deep. They could be very shallow, but yeah, they are usually crawling along the bottom, or maybe they're crawling along rocks or coral or whatever's down there on the seafloor.
Okay, so another question that kind of popped up was, so are these similar to the kind of snails we see on land as well?
Yeah, so they are related to land snails and slugs. So slugs and snails are kind of sister groups in the family tree. The snails with their shells came first, and then the slugs kind of evolved after, and they have found other ways to protect themselves without a shell.
Okay, well, speaking of protecting themselves, let's go ahead and dive in a little bit more about what exactly do nudibranchs do roaming around in the ocean?
Yeah, so protecting themselves is something that they're really great at. And one of the ways that they do that is by stealing protection from other species.
Stealing?
Yeah, they are crazy like that. They'll steal from what they eat, actually. So let me back up a bit. This is one of the favorite, most popular species of nudibranch out there because of its crazy abilities. It actually eats the Portuguese man-of-war, which is also up there. And so, looking at the Portuguese man-of-war, you can kind of tell that it might be dangerous. Anyone have any suggestions for what the danger is?
Go ahead and use that chat box. Let us know. What is dangerous about a Portuguese man-of-war? All right. Yeah. So thank you so much, everybody, for sharing those. They're poisonous with their stingers.
They sting. So they can actually inject a venom into you when they sting you. But this nudibranch is able to eat those stingers, the actual stinging part, and not only does it survive that process, but it also preserves those stingers and puts them into its body. So at the tip of its serrata, which are like those fan wavy things, the serrata that I mentioned earlier that have part of its guts. So the stinging cell gets moved through the digestive system out to the end of the serrata, and they have a special kind of area where they get stored so that then they can sting something that attacks them. So it's like stealing a weapon from this really dangerous animal that's out there.
That's crazy. They steal the stingers and then place them kind of on themselves, and then that's a way that they can protect themselves.
Yeah, and it makes them venomous as well. And so they wouldn't naturally have a venom, but now they do because they stole it.
Yeah. All right. Well, this isn't the only type of stealing that we see in nudibranchs as well. There's another one, right?
Yeah. So there's other species that instead of eating, man-of-war or jellyfish, they will actually eat corals. And corals have a special ability where they have this little plant that lives inside of them, and it generates energy for the coral. So the nudibranch can eat the coral and steal the little plant that's inside of it and put it into its own body. So this one that you see here has all those little brown spots it's a plant living inside the nudibranch that it stole from the coral that it ate, and so it gets extra energy from that plant.
Wow. So they're experts at stealing.
Oh yeah. They call it kleptopredation, actually. So
I didn't know there was a word for that.
Klepto refers to stealing, and then predation because they're eating the things and then stealing from it. Yeah.
Pretty cool. So I'm noticing that there's a lot of different colors within nudibranchs themselves. And it looks like this one was able to steal some of that color. Are all of them really colorful nudibranchs?
So a lot of them are really colorful, but then a lot of them are actually less colorful. They actually blend into their environment. So they're camouflaged, and that way they can hide from predators. So we have a few species here. There's 4 different types. that are all camouflaged on a coral that they live on that coral and they eat that coral and they blend in. So it's your job right now to try to find all of the nudibranchs.
All right, so kind of like an I Spy game. All right, let's go ahead and give about a couple of minutes for you to point out those different nudibranchs within each of these pictures.
And there's also a nudibranch in the video stream of us. If you can find the nudibranch in this picture as well.
All right, take about another 30 seconds. All right, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and reveal where those nudibranchs are. So for our first picture, there we go.
Yeah.
Pretty neat. And this one right here, let's see if I can kind of get it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Takes up almost the whole picture, but blends perfectly with the coral behind it.
Mm-hmm. And then we have another one kind of, a little bit to the left. Sorry, my circling isn't that great right now. And then our last picture, we actually have quite a few in here.
Yeah.
So we have 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
And kind of like right there, and then one way down here.
Yeah, there's 6 nudibranchs on that coral.
And then you want to show everybody your nudibranch.
Right. So I also have nudibranchs on my ears right now.
I love the earrings. That's great.
Yeah.
All right. So we saw that on our pictures we had a lot of nudibranchs, but there was also something hidden there as well.
Yeah. So when you first look at these photos, maybe what pops out to you is this white stuff that's on the coral. And so next to the nudibranchs, yeah, you see all of these kind of curved, C-shaped or fan-shaped wavy white things. Those are actually sets of eggs. And so they call it like a ribbon of eggs. And so these nudibranchs, not only are they living and eating on the coral, they're even laying their eggs on the coral. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about their life cycle. So these nudibranchs, once they've found a coral and are on it, they're not going to go very far. They'll stay on that coral, and so that means that in order to reproduce, they have to find their mate on that coral. So here we've got some nudibranchs that are blending into this red coral, but they somehow find each other. And crazy thing about nudibranchs and most slugs and snails is that they don't have to worry about who's the male, who's the female, because they're both male and female. They're all what we call hermaphrodites. So that helps them out a little bit. It means they don't have to try as hard to find the right kind of mate. So they will mate. They'll end up laying their eggs on the coral, like in the photo, those little white things. And each one of those has maybe 100 eggs. They're very, very tiny eggs, and they lay a ton of them. And then all of those eggs will hatch out, and they'll be tiny little baby larvae nudibranchs that go into the water, and they will either get pushed around by ocean currents, or they'll even swim a little bit until they kind of smell the coral that they came from, and so, or the same type of coral.
Oh.
And so there's these chemicals that corals put out into the water that the nudibranchs can actually sense with their rhinophores. So they'll stop swimming, they'll settle down onto that coral or whatever else habitat the nudibranch is looking for, and they'll develop into adults, and the cycle continues.
Wow, that's really cool. So we've had a couple of questions that kind of have popped in about how many of those eggs are laid.
Yeah, so it could be thousands, really, which is very common for marine animals, especially invertebrates. They'll lay thousands of eggs, and maybe only a very small percentage will survive. We don't have a good estimate because we need more science, actually, to study how many of them are surviving.
Okay, and we were kind of wondering about how long does it take to go through this life cycle, and then also how long do they actually live?
Yeah, so the adult part of the life cycle is a few months that they'll live. The eggs, that's actually a good question. I'm not really sure how long it takes before the eggs hatch, because I think it varies between all the different species, but probably just a few days or a week, really. And once they hatch, it also varies how long that little larva stays as a larva in the water, because some of them can last up to like a month. If they're able to actually feed on plankton in the water, they can last for a while that way.
Wow. So it sounds like because there's so many different types of nudibranchs, there's so many different lengths of how long they live. Wow, that's really cool. So we're kind of wondering, diving into what exactly do you study about nudibranchs, and how do you study them?
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, I'm really interested in biodiversity, and so nudibranchs are really diverse. There's thousands of species. So what I do is I go to where we find the most species of nudibranchs, because if you want to know why we have so many species, you want to go to where they all live, right? So there's a place called the Coral Triangle, which is out in Southeast Asia. And it's called the Coral Triangle because it has the most coral in the world. So that map is showing the number of different coral species that live in any given area. And the dark red is showing the most. It's at least 500, sometimes 600 different species of coral. And the place that has the most coral is kind of roughly shaped like a triangle. So we call it the Coral Triangle. And there are so many other marine species that live on coral reefs that it's really the highest biodiversity in the whole ocean is out there in that Coral Triangle. So it's the best place to ask the question, why do we have so many species? Because they're all there coexisting. So when I'm going out, it's pretty great, I have to say. That's my favorite part of my job, is going out into the coral reefs and going snorkeling or scuba diving. And even though I'm looking for nudibranchs, I get to see a lot of other things while I'm underwater. So some of my favorite things that I see are lionfish, that's what's in the middle there. Sea turtles are pretty common. Clownfish, so it's kind of like Finding Nemo. I find Nemo a lot of times. And all kinds of different fish and clams and worms and just crazy animals. So it can be distracting, but I have to focus in and find the nudibranchs. And I look for the nudibranchs that are eating coral, so I have to find the coral first. And I pick up, don't try this at home. You shouldn't normally pick up coral. It's just because I'm, trained scientist that I'm allowed to do that. But I'll pick up the coral, find the nudibranchs on it, and then actually collect them using some tweezers so that I can take them back to the lab and learn more about them. So I swim back to the lab, which is sometimes just a shack on
wow.
on the water. So this is a photo from Indonesia out in the Coral Triangle. And we had this little lab area where I'll take a lot of photos of the nudibranchs, and then ultimately I'll preserve them in alcohol, because we want to be able to study them for a long time. So we have a huge collection of these slugs here in the museum. And so I've brought, as an example, when we bring them back to the museum, we put them in these jars with all of the information about where they came from. And the nudibranch itself ends up losing its color, because when you put it in alcohol, all the color kind of bleeds out into the alcohol. Luckily, that's why we take photos, and we take notes so that we know what colors they were. And then with these specimens, we can then we can get a lot of information. And the thing that I focus on a lot is actually the DNA. So I'm interested in looking at genetics to figure out how all these different species are related. And so we'll take DNA from the samples. You can get it out in the lab, and then we'll sequence the DNA and figure out, based on those sequences, how closely related they are. So different species have different DNA, and the more similar the species, the more similar their DNA will be. So we basically just build a family tree of nudibranch species, and then we can look at what different traits the different species have, and maybe figure out how they all evolved.
Interesting. Now, in your time doing the sequencing of DNA and building out that family tree, have you discovered anything new?
Yeah, so we actually discover new species all the time. Sometimes it's a little more obvious, like, you know, you're out in the ocean, you're looking for one species, and you find something you've never seen before, like it's the case with this one, where I thought that I was going to find a species that I knew about, and I looked closely, and it turns out it's this new species that doesn't even have a name yet. And so once you find one new species, you kind of have your eyes open, looking more and more. So then when I was looking for this species, I came across this species, which again, no one had ever found before.
Wow.
And I wouldn't have seen it except that I saw the eggs first, because the white of the egg stands out more than the slug itself, which is camouflaged, right?
Exactly. This one was one of the harder ones to spot out.
So I never would have seen it except for those eggs. And then a funny story about this one, which does have to do with genetics. So I thought that when I collected it, I thought it was a species I already knew about. And then we sequenced the DNA, and not only was it a new species, but it matched the DNA of a species that had been found here in the museum, in the aquarium. So we have a big aquarium here with lots of corals.
Yeah.
And we didn't intentionally bring nudibranchs back to the aquarium, but this nudibranch caught a ride on a coral all the way from Asia and was still alive in the aquarium.
Wow.
So it was a new species discovered here, and also I found it out in the coral reef, and then someone else found it here, and it's turned out to be the same species.
Very cool. So we happen to have a hitchhiker on our coral.
Yeah.
Gotta look a little bit careful next time.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you've been doing a lot of research, but it's not just you who are looking for coral or for these nudibranchs as well, right?
Right. So I've been asking for everyone else's help. We actually have a website and an app called iNaturalist, and it's not just for nudibranchs, it's for all plants and animals. But anyone, you included, can take photos and upload them, and we will help you identify them, and you'll be helping us figure out where all of these species live. So if you happen to live near the ocean, and you can go out and look in tide pools. You could find nudibranchs and share your photos with us. Or if you go out to the coral reefs, that's what I'm most interested in. If you happen to go out on vacation maybe to some coral reefs and find some nudibranchs on corals, we're trying to figure out where all of these species are, because sometimes you find a new species and we've only ever seen it one time, but it probably lives a lot of other places too.
Oh, interesting. So it sounds like that corals are not, nudibranchs are not just found in coral reefs. They're also found in other places. Where here in the U.S. can we find some more?
Yeah, so you can find them everywhere. They're all over the world, and the only place they're not is land. So they're related to land slugs, but nudibranchs only live in the ocean. And if you live near the ocean, you can go out and find them in tide pools. So if it's a really low tide, you can kind of, they're usually pretty brightly colored actually. So they're not very hard to find, but you might have to look underneath rocks, or maybe if there's a bunch of anemones, which are usually in tide pools around here, you might have to kind of look around. They might be hidden somewhere. Yeah.
All right, great. So we've been getting a lot of questions in our chat box, and I wanted to leave some time to be able to address those questions. And one of those questions is, how long have you been studying nudibranchs?
Yeah, so I've been studying nudibranchs for 7 years, but scientists in general have been studying them for about 200, 300 years now. And here at the Academy of Sciences is one of the largest nudibranch collections in the world, because we have another nudibranch scientist here who has been doing it since probably 30, 40 years now.
Something like that. He's been studying for a long time.
So he has actually discovered the most new species of nudibranchs.
When you say the most, approximately how much is that?
1,000.
1,000?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons I decided to come here to the museum after finishing my graduate program at UCLA, was to work with Dr. Gosleiner and all of his collections here.
So we had a question that came in about how deep is the water that you normally go to find these nudibranchs?
Yeah, so I actually don't go very deep, because I can find them in 3-4 feet of water. The deepest I'll go is maybe 30 feet. But there are some scientists here that I know who go down a lot deeper. There's even some who go down to 500 feet, and they find nudibranchs down there too.
That's right, in that what we call twilight zone, where there's not much light.
Yeah.
Crazy. Wow, they can live in a lot of different places.
Yeah, and the one that eats the Portuguese manivore that I showed earlier, it actually lives all over the world, kind of in open water. So that one is maybe one of the more common ones that you could see in the ocean.
Cool. Well, we had a couple of other questions. One in the beginning of, do nudibranchs hear, or how do they communicate?
So that's a good question, because we don't really know. It's funny. Those are our favorite questions as scientists, is the ones we don't know the answers to. They do have sensory organs, so those rhinophores that they have on their head, they can use to sense chemicals, maybe vibrations, which is essentially what sound is. It's just vibrations in the air, or the water, I guess, for them. So yeah, we don't really know if they can hear sound. They don't have ears like we do, but they might have some sort of organ that is equivalent to that. Yeah.
All right, so definitely a question we need a little bit more research on, and maybe, who knows, one of our students might help us answer that question. So we had another question that came in of, how exactly do they get their color? Because we saw some really bright ones. We also saw some that were a little bit more camouflaged. How do they do that?
So there's a lot of different ways to get color, and nudibranchs do them all. One is by eating, so they can take the color from what they're eating. That's the case with the ones that eat the corals. They will take on whatever color the coral is. Or some of them, it's just coded into their DNA. So they produce colors based on, it's part of who they are as a species, is their ability to produce these colors.
So I've heard you say it's similar to like it's in our DNA, just like our skin color and our hair color.
Yeah. So just the same as we have all kinds of different skin pigments in humans, and the same is true with nudibranchs, and it just comes from their DNA.
Wonderful. So we had a couple of questions that came in about what is the smallest nudibranch you have studied?
Well, I love this question because I found it accidentally. And so what you're seeing right now is one of these nudibranchs that is maybe this big. So that's actually pretty big that's normal. That's average for a nudibranch.
Okay, so kind of palm size?
Yeah, like maybe like this big. But, so I was looking at this nudibranch. It's not the smallest nudibranch, but on it, there's this little white speck. You see right there, that white thing? Turns out that is a nudibranch that's living on this other nudibranch. So, I was just like, I was trying to take a clean picture, and I thought it was a grain of sand, and it wouldn't come off. And then I realized it's another nudibranch. And not only that, but that was another new species discovery.
Wow. So not only did you find your smallest nudibranch, you also found a new species.
Yeah.
That's great. So it sounds like you're finding a lot of new species over and over again.
Yeah.
Pretty cool. So was that the most recent new species you found?
No, actually, one of the photos I showed earlier from the kind of I Spot game, one of those very camouflaged ones, that I like this story because I didn't find it, but much like you all, I was out there telling people how to find nudibranchs. I was saying, you can look at these corals really closely and look for the eggs. And if you see eggs, then look even more closely, and there's probably a nudibranch. And so I was telling this woman who is, she works in scuba diving. So she leads tours underwater. And she thought that they were really cool. And so the next week after we had left, she emailed me a picture of this nudibranch, and it was, none of us had ever seen it before. So she discovered a new species on her own after I told her how to find them. And so that was just, it was less than a year ago.
Wow, that's really cool. So if you discover new species, do you get to name them?
Yeah, I usually do. It's a long process. So sometimes instead, if you discover a new species, you can give it to a scientist who's really good at describing them, and then you can pick the name, or you can ask them to name it after you.
Oh, so do you have any nudibranchs named after you?
Not yet. I don't know. I like to name things after like some sort of function or their ecology or something. So
okay.
So yeah, we'll see. We're in the process of coming up with names for some of these species.
All right, so stay tuned. We'll see. Eventually, maybe, but I like that you name them after kind of those adaptations that they have. Cool. So we had a couple of questions asking about are they poisonous, and how do you handle a poisonous nudibranch?
Yeah, so some of them are poisonous, especially the ones that eat, the ones that eat the stinging animals. They'll be able to sting you. Some of them will eat poisonous sponges, and then they'll absorb that poison. The safest way to handle them is with gloves and tweezers, essentially. They're like little forceps, we call them. So when I collect them, I don't usually touch them with my bare hands. But I'm actually not really collecting poisonous ones anyway, so I'm not in danger from the nudibranchs. There's actually a lot more other things out there in the ocean that I'm more worried about. But yeah, in general, it's best to only touch them with some other sort of tool instead of your bare hands.
All right. Well, I know we have a lot of questions that came on in, and we'll be creating a list of these questions and some of those answers and sending them to your way. But before we go, can you give us any tips of how to find a nudibranch if we happen to go to a tide pool, like here in California, or happen to be actually out in the corals?
Yeah, well, I think it always helps to look at a guidebook of some sort, or there's some on the internet as well, just so that you know what you're looking for first. And they can be really camouflaged, so there's no guarantees, but I would say have a few different species in your head that you know live there based on the guidebook or the field guide, so that you have like a picture of what they look like in your head, and then you just have to spend a long time staring into the water. Honestly, like they could be anywhere. It does really help to know what they eat, because they're always going to be looking for that food source, and luckily they'll be on their food source as well. So if you know what they eat, you're more likely to find one.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for the Scientist Scoop on the nudibranchs, these colorful creatures of the sea. And thank you, Allison, so much for joining us today. Now, again, we will be sending this information via a email, as well as that link to those sea slugs swimming in the ocean. Really exciting. And I want to say thank you everybody again for joining us, and we would love for you to join us for our next Scientist Scoop with Canopy Meg at the end of the month. Thank you everybody. Bye.